What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So the story of War Thor is actually really interesting, and it's really cool because this gives us a version of Thor that we haven't necessarily seen before. But a lot of this is really just sort of up to interpretation in a lot of ways too. And the reason I say that is because we covered Thor's the other day, and we basically sat down and we looked at this idea of the hammer that belonged to Ultimate Thor and what it was that happened to the hammer. Now, the weird thing about this is that over the years, Ultimate Thor's hammer had kind of received this sort of bouncing around in the sense that it was destroyed, it was remade, different things like that. There was one point where he actually got this sort of, traditional Mjolnir that we see in the main Marvel universe. Not the exact same one, but something similar to it. But the idea was that in the Thor's storyline from Secret Wars, that Ultimate Thor was one of these individuals who served as Doctor Doom's police force, basically. And what had happened was that in this massive brawl among these different versions of Thor, that the Ultimate Hammer had left the Secret Wars universe and was either transported throughout all space and time or just transported into the past or something along those lines, but it ended up in Asgard. It basically broke through the dimensional barriers and ended up in this pocket dimension of Asgard. Now, in truth, that should not have been allowed to happen. The entire basis behind Secret Wars was that all conceivable universes and all spaces, dimensions, the whole, all that stuff, those were all destroyed in the collapse of the multiverse. Everything was gone, and the only chunk of existence that was left was Battleworld. So again, it kind of fit into a weird situation, but this gives us an update in terms of what's going on, in the sense of what this hammer's capable of and what it can do. Now, one thing to keep in mind is there are two schools of thought that are currently floating around right now in terms of the nature of this hammer. The school of thought that I ascribe to is that it's the hammer that originally belonged to Ultimate Thor. But there is a school of thought that also believes that this hammer was used by Ultimate Thor, but was actually forged by Doctor Doom during the events of Battleworld. As far as I'm aware, we're not explicitly told if that's true in terms of which version of the hammer this is. All we know is that it's a hammer that does not have a worthiness enchantment. And as we go through this, we'll actually find out this hammer is almost identical in terms of what it can do to the actual hammer of Thor. But the other half of this is that for those of you guys who are just now joining us, we are basically in the midst of what's called the War of Realms. And the idea here is that this is essentially a being named Malekith the Accursed trying to conquer all things in existence. That's basically what it is. Now, Malekith the Accursed is a really cool villain. He's had the Casket of Ancient Winners, but he's always been this sort of background villain. Malekith was always around there somewhere in some form or fashion. What War of the Realms does is it actually brings him to full focus. And essentially what he had been doing is traveling around the various realms of Asgard and recruiting different people to his cause. Initially, it was the Frost Giants, then it became the Trolls, and it became all these different groups who rallied to Malekith, knowing that Malekith probably had the wherewithal to win the conflict. And the reason for that is the other half of the equation. Because while Malekith was traveling around and trying to conquer everything, everybody looked to Asgard as the people who would save them. The problem is that Asgard had a lot of inner turmoil because there was this huge civil war going on in terms of whether or not Jane Foster was actually Thor. And so because that, it led to like Odin taking sides against Jane Foster. It led to Odin's wife Freya going on the side of Jane Foster, and it led to this great big huge conflict. And so because of this, it allowed Malekith the Accursed to begin the process of going through and just conquering all these different realms with almost no one to stand in his way. Now, in this instance, what this does is it picks up with the aftermath of the death of the Light Elves, which are one of the various race of elves that exists within the Asgardian mythos. And the idea was that the Light Elves were one of the first groups that Malekith took out, just because the Light Elves and the Dark Elves are mortal enemies. And so with the Light Elves being pushed to the brink of extinction, what they had done is they had taken up residence with the dwarves. Now, the dwarves are extremely important in Asgardian mythos. The reason for this is because of the fact that the dwarves are basically the greatest craftsmen in all of the Asgardian realms. They're the ones that forged the hammer of Thor. Now, it's kind of a funny thing here because we actually pick up with Volstagg, with Raz Solomon, and with the Queen of the Light Elves. And the cool thing about this is that Raz Solomon was originally a character who was introduced as just this random shield agent. And it was actually this girl who had this desire to basically go on a date with Thor, which he granted to her. Odin's son went on a date with Raz Solomon. But ever since then, she's always been kind of this recurring supporting character, but she is quite versed in the Asgardian mythos just because of the fact that she's traveled around and seen a lot of these different things. But Volstagg himself is also a really kindly guy who's also like a force to be reckoned with, because in truth, he's one of the Warriors 3 that exist inside of the main Marvel universe, and he's one of the most capable warriors that exist out there, one of the bravest men around. The problem with the War of Realms is that it takes its toll in every conceivable way, physically, because of the loss of life, because people who have to fight over and over and over again simply to just survive. But it also takes a psychological toll. And the reason for this is because Volstagg, of course, spending time with these light elf children, is basically met with the arrival of the forces of Surtur that immediately show up in the land of the dwarves and start tearing everything to pieces. The problem with this is that the parents of these light elves are all killed. The parents of these children are all totally destroyed. And it leaves Volstagg in a situation where he's just kind of required to take care of them as best he can and sort of go through there and call it a day. The issue is that as he makes his way through there, and as these forces of Surtur basically begin to emerge and continue wreaking all this havoc, they end up killing the kids. Now, this is when this psychological break happens in the mind of Volstagg. While he has seen a multitude of conflicts, a multitude of battles, and a multitude of wars, it's one thing to basically fight against an enemy to eliminate them in their entirety, and it's another to stand there and be helpless in the face of loss of life. And that's why this is so huge, is because he literally just experiences this sort of psychic break. I mean, it just cracks him almost in two. And so in response to this, he does the only thing he can do. He literally seeks out the ultimate hammer and picks it up. Now remember, when the ultimate hammer crash landed in old Asgard during the events of Thor's, it was basically safeguarded. It was this idea that no one's going to pick it up. No one's going to go and take it. No one's going to use it because no one really knows how it works. This whole conflict, this whole idea of whether or not Jane Foster is worthy has thrown into sharp relief the idea that just because a person picks up the hammer of Odin does not mean that everyone in Asgard is going to believe that person is Thor. And so because of that, people do not want to experience yet another civil war within Asgard going on at the same time as the first. And so what they ended up doing was say, this is all hands off. Now, of course, the idea was that Odin's son himself would be the one who would maintain the hammer. The problem with this is that when Jane Foster went to him and basically said, hey, I am currently Thor, I'm the one who was able to pick up your hammer, it was sort of a betrayal for Odin's son in the sense that their relationship had gone back, both as friends and even as people who were an item at one time, it had gone back for quite some time. And for Odin's son, it was this idea that if Jane Foster was going to become the new Thor, the very least she could do is tell him, if only out of just respect for the legacy that he carried. The fact that she hid it means there's a lack of trust there. And in that belief of a lack of trust, Odin's son just kind of looked at her with a skewed eye. And so again, this creates this whole huge inner turmoil because with War Thor showing up, he goes to town. And the reason for this is because he shows up in this camp, these armies of Surtur's forces, and just obliterate. I mean, it's one of the most spectacular displays of absolute decimation that I've ever seen. But notice this is not Volstagg in his traditional sense. He's kindly, he's more of a jovial character as opposed to like this battle-hardened, everything has to die kind of character. Now, the other half of this is that his path of destruction is being monitored by Amora the Enchantress and Ulik, King of the Trolls. Now, these are two of the most powerful beings in all of Asgard. Trying to take out War Thor, none of it works. Now, what this does is this hits home at the nature of the ultimate hammer of Thor. In the Ultimate Universe, the hammer was originally tech-based. Over the course of the years, it almost seemed as though the hammer was moving up to becoming almost equivalent to the hammer of Thor in the main Marvel Universe, but it was never on that level. It was basically a tech-based hammer. The issue with this is that this is why I say this seems to ascribe to the idea that the hammer as it exists now was forged by Dr. Doom during the events of Battleworld when the Thor core was being formed. Because we basically end up seeing a display of power that we've never seen before. The ability of the hammer to deflect blasts, to basically eliminate magics in a way that we hadn't seen before. And so again, that's why it looks as though it's a hammer forged by Dr. Doom, but we're not explicitly told that that's the case. But regardless of the circumstances, even with him having this hammer, whether he has it or not, Volstagg is still a match for almost anybody out there just because of how strong he is. He almost kills both Enchantress and Ulik. It's not until Enchantress uses her abilities and basically summons the Black Bifrost, which is to say their own teleportation system, and gets them out of there, that she manages to survive the experience. But within Volstagg himself, there's a sort of inner turmoil. This idea that he realizes something's off. Now, what this all seems to do is hit at home to the very nature of the hammers themselves. Because remember, for years and years and years and years, it was this idea that Thor's hammer was just a hammer. Something he picked up, it had a worthiness enchantment, magic was somehow involved, and then he was able to do all kinds of stuff with it. He could teleport, he could fly, he could do all manner of things. It wasn't until recent years when Jason Aaron came back and gave us the untold origin of Thor's hammer, when he basically established that the hammer of Thor is basically possessed by this sort of cosmic storm that was equal in power to Odin himself. Odin was able to basically channel the storm into a chunk of Uru, send it over to the dwarves, have them craft it into a hammer, and then his son was eventually able to pick it up. In this particular story, what seems to be going on, or at least what Jason Aaron is hitting at, is that much like the hammer of Thor being sentient, this ultimate hammer is sentient as well. But it's basically sentient with the wrath of a universe that's long since been destroyed. All that energy and all that power is channeled directly into the hammer itself. And so what it means is that it's quite literally dominating Volstagg. And that's why it's such a huge deal, is because in the midst of all this, one thing to keep in mind is that it also reminds us that Jane Foster is still dying. One of the things that Jason Aaron established almost immediately before Jane Foster ever picked up the hammer in the first place is that it was ever going to be a temporary thing. That because of the fact that she has cancer, because she's basically dying, she does undergo chemotherapy. But every time she becomes Thor, it purges the chemotherapy from her system. And so in a sense, she might as well have never had chemotherapy at all. And so the result is that she's constantly dying of cancer. And what it'll do is it'll eventually get to the point where she will die altogether and she will never have the hammer again. She'll be dead. But what this does is this actually transfers us for a second to a place called Muspelheim, the realm of Surtur, the realm of these fire demons. And we actually end up picking up with his daughter, Cinder. Now, the crazy thing about this is that Surtur has been dead for quite some time. Surtur was basically destroyed by Odin, or at least his essence was destroyed by Odin. And so what this did is it allowed for some measure of a power vacuum within Muspelheim itself. Now, this vacuum was filled almost immediately by Cinder, but this is the first time we see her character. This is the first time she's being introduced. Surtur had had a whole bunch of children over the years. She was the first one to basically prove herself worthy of taking over her father's role. Remember, Surtur is this guy who basically has it out for Odin and all the Asgardians. And a lot of that's because of the fact that Odin and his brothers had faced off against Surtur. Odin was responsible for imprisoning Surtur in Earth. And so it's really one of those things where it's more like a blood vendetta as opposed to, you know, some eternal battle that was always destined to happen or something along those lines. But the idea is that with Malekith showing up alongside Loki, keep in mind, originally Loki was sent to Malekith by Freya to be a spy for the Asgardians. Somewhere along the line, he seems to have turncoated and abandoned his mother's cause, taking up his cause with Malekith. But we don't know that for certain. Loki's very much a wild card in this story. He seems to be an ally, but we don't know for sure. But regardless of the reasoning behind it, Malekith running this sort of Council of Realms, the idea is to basically make sure that everybody has their own role to play and to make sure they're playing their roles effectively. The fire demons are some of the most formidable beings out there. When they show up and they start cleansing places, those places are gone. But for Malekith, it's also a very tenuous situation, because if they chose to turn on him, then not only would he be facing the Asgardians, he would be facing the fire demons. And so again, the goal is to very much make sure that they're playing their role. But what he also does is essentially show up and say, you have a new Thor on the scene, and this new Thor needs to be taken care of as quickly as possible, because this new Thor was able to single-handedly take down your entire army. Now, what this does is it leads to a battle between War Thor and Cinder. And this is something that I want to talk about for a second, because this is interesting to me. If this were Surtur, this battle would be over before it even started. When it comes to someone like Surtur, you're talking about a guy who went toe-to-toe with Odin, killed Odin prior to the events of Ragnarok. We're talking about a very capable being that's out there. Surtur being out of the picture, his daughter Cinder taking the place, she's not on that same level of power. She's capable, but she's not on that level. And so what this does is it gives us a battle between the two, but I don't want you to see this as something, you know, with regards to War Thor being a lot more powerful than he is. Not at all. This is not like War Thor fighting Surtur. The other half of this is that the death of all these kids keep playing over constantly in the mind of Volstagg, and that's what drives him. While the hammer does kind of seize control of him, the idea of feeding these images into his mind time and time again of these kids dying continues to push him to the point where all he wants to do is destroy. All he wants to do is see the death of all things. Now, because of the fact that War Thor cares nothing about everything that exists in Muspelheim, what it does is it brings him and it brings Jane Foster Thor directly into conflict with one another. Now, the reason why this happens is because of the fact that in the mind of Jane Foster, while Cinder is a terrible ruler, while Cinder is a terrible being, you know, all she wants to do is just sort of see the destruction of the Asgardians, Cinder herself is not a reflection of the beings within Muspelheim. There are innocents there. There are young children who are fire demon children, but they are young children nonetheless. They have not had the chance to actually grow and adopt their own mindset. Jane Foster sees these kids as basically innocents, the ability to move on and to have their own lives. dies. If, Muspelheim is going to be freed of the control of Cinder and the entire legacy of Surtur, then it starts with the defeat of Cinder herself, and then giving the survivors the opportunity to forge their own path. But in the eyes of Jane Foster, it is not acceptable to kill kids. And so what this does is it basically brings Jane Foster and War Thor to this place, this sort of in-between area called the Yawning Void. Now, what this does is it basically seems to indicate this empty space in between dimensions, or maybe where all life seemed to hail from, or something along those lines. The Asgardian depiction of the origin of all things is a little bit different from what we're normally used to in the main Marvel universe. In the beginning, there was only just darkness, that was it. And then darkness somehow gave form to life. Life gave form to more life, gave form to planets, gave form to, stars, systems, different things like that. But it all started with absolute darkness. And the idea is that the Yawning Void is that absolute darkness. It's that lack of anything. There's nothing there. They're basically fighting in a space where there is no concern about, anybody being in danger. There's no concern about loss of life or anything along those lines. But the idea is that the fight between the two of them just starts spreading through. I mean, it literally tears through all these different facets of the realms, in the sense that those who were in the equivalent of hell within the Asgardian mythos can see this fight take place. Those who are in heaven, where Angela comes from, can see this fight taking place. It's really not until Jane Foster takes the ultimate hammer of Thor that we as the reader learn that it has been possessing Volstagg the entire time, poisoning his mind. But again, it's sort of a wild scenario, because once Odinson realizes that Volstagg is War Thor, that Volstagg is going on this path of tearing things up, initially Odinson tries to reason with him. The problem with this is that Volstagg seems to be beyond the point of reason. I mean, he's literally a mad dog, driven by the only motivation to just see all things destroyed. It's just nothing but anger and wrath and rage. And so it's kind of cool, because it's almost one of those things of music soothes the savage beast, in the sense that Jane Foster simply puts the hammer down and lets all pretense go and approaches Volstagg as just a normal person. Now, this is cool, because this is designed to show Jane Foster as being effective as not just Thor, but also as Jane Foster the character. In this instance, Odinson basically just kind of sends the hammer away, tells the hammer, get out of here, you're not supposed to be here, sends it back to Asgard, and that's really about it. But it's this idea that Malekith continues his campaign of grabbing all these different armies from around the Asgardian realm and bringing them to his cause. His next stop is the realm of heaven. His next stop is to basically step in to the angels themselves and say, become part of my council of realms. Help me basically conquer everything, and I will restore your rightful place among the Asgardian landscape. But with that being said, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.